Lists are a useful way of displaying information to a user, but they're also useful for storing multiple pieces of related data. In a computer program, a single piece of data is stored in a variable, but if you have multiple pieces of data that are related to each other, you store them in a list. For example, if you're collecting all the finishing times for all the people running a race so that you could calculate the mean or median times after the race, you'd store all the times in a list and then use that list to do the mean and median calculations after all the times have been collected. You might also use a list to store the names of all the students in a class and then use a random number generator to randomly select a student from the class list. We're going to start by creating a very simple example of how a list is used. To get started, we'll go to the Events block and we'll use the When Green Flag Clicked to start our program. Then I'm going to go down to Variables, and this time, rather than creating a variable, I'm going to go down to where it says Make a List. I'm going to click on that and type in a name for my list. I'll call it My List, and click OK. As soon as I've created a list, you can see that it gives us a number of new functions and commands here that we can use. The first thing I'm going to do is drag out one of these adds, and I'm going to be adding names to a list. So I'm going to type in first name, and I'll drag out another one, and drag out a couple more, and fill in some new names. If I ran the program right now, you can see that it would go ahead, it would create the list, and it would add those 3 names into the list. The next thing I'd like to do is have the Scratch Cat read out all of the names in the list. Before I do that, however, there's one other thing to note. If I click on the Go again, it's going to keep adding names to the list. So it's storing the list until I run the program again. That's not always how computer programs work, but in this case, that's how it's working. So we need to do one little bit of house cleaning before we go on, and that is to take the delete all of my list and put that at the start. All that does is a little bit of house cleaning. When you run the program, it's going to go and clean everything out of the list. So if I run it again now, you can see it deleted everything and then added 3 new entries back in. The next thing I want it to do is have the Scratch Cat read out each of the names. I can see that this is probably going to be useful to have a loop, because I'm going to have it loop through 3 times to read once for each name. Now I'm going to go back up to Looks, and I'm going to get it to drop in the Say Hello. I'm going to change that to 1 second. Now, obviously, I don't want it to say hello. I want it to say each of the names. So I'm going to go down to Variables and look at my list and look at the bubbles that I have available to me. This first bubble here says Item 1 of my list. Well, you think about it, Item 1 of my list, the first thing I added was Nathan. So if I tell it to do that, it will say Nathan. The problem, of course, is that it repeats through that loop 3 times. It keeps saying Nathan because it's always item number 1. So what I want my program to do is change the number that it's showing each time. In order to do that, I need some kind of a counter, and usually when I'm using a counter, it means I need a variable. So by default, we have my variable automatically created in Scratch. So in this case, I'm going to drop in a command that says set my variable to, and instead of 0, I'm going to tell it to set to 1. And now, instead of saying display item 1, I'm going to ask it to display my variable. Remember, my variable basically will return whatever number that variable is set to. So if my variable right now is set to 1, it's going to return the first item in the list. So if I run the program, it's going to do exactly the same as last time, where it just shows us Nathan 3 times. Because it's just showing Nathan 3 times, my variable never changes from 1. So we need to make a change to variable. We do that by using the change my variable, and we're going to tell it to change my variable by 1. So that means it's going to start at 1 up here, and then when it gets to this line, it's going to change it to 2, and then 3, and so on. So let's see what happens now when we run the program. Nathan, Emily, and Adil. So it's going through now and showing us each of our names. The only problem we've got now is what happens if we take our program and we add another name to our list, and I put my program back on. Now if I run the program, we've got Sundus in the list, but when it reads out the names, the Scratch Cat stops at Adil, of course, because we've got the repeat is only set to do 3 times. The key here now is we need to get some information back from our list as to how long the list is. So rather than having to go back and modify this number every time I add something to the list, I want that number to automatically know how many people are in the list. Luckily, the functionality of Scratch gives us that ability, and I can go and take this bubble that says length of list and drop that in its place. Length of list is a function that will always return the number of items that are in the list. So if I run the program now, it goes through Nathan, Emily, Adil, and Sundus. It knows to go through as many items are in the list. So that's a fairly quick example of how you use a list to store information and then to retrieve that information and display it on screen.